At 19, Luther Ashby learned exactly what his uncle believed he was worth. Food, boot leather, winter coal. Every dollar spent raising an orphan had been tallied in a ledger, as if Luther were livestock that had failed to earn its feed. By sundown, he was ordered out. He left with $11, a few meager belongings, an Osage orange marking knife, and a bronze-colored dog named Copper walking beside him. 3 days later, men at the Red Basin Land Office laughed as Luther spent $4 on an abandoned claim no one else would touch. Deadwell Ranch. The cabin leaned. The soil was crusted with alkali. Everyone believed he had purchased a grave with a roof, mostly because the 43-foot well had been dry for years. But when Luther descended into the dark shaft and his tool struck the bottom, it didn't sound like earth. It sounded hollow. Metal rang sharply behind a crooked course of stone. Above, Copper growled into the dark. What lay hidden there proved the well had never truly died at all. What was its true value? The answer was waiting for him. But for Luther, the bitter lesson about value had begun long before. 8 years earlier, Luther had known another roof. He was born at a freight station east of Red Basin Crossing. His father, Hiram Ashby, repaired saddles and drove wagons. His mother, Clara, kept the ledger and taught Luther to read from crate labels, invoices, and newspapers. They were never rich, but the house had order. Hiram taught him knots, balance, and how weight shifted on a loaded axle. Clara taught him sums with dried beans across the table. At supper, every chair was filled. Then winter brought lung sickness with a caravan. Hiram died first. Clara followed 6 days later. At 11, Luther was sent to live with his uncle, Orphaned Ashby, owner of a feed warehouse. Orson never struck him. He put him to work, sweeping floors, carrying sacks, tending horses, patching barrels, sleeping in the storage room. In Orson's house, food was counted, shelter was counted. Soon, Luther understood that his existence had been entered in a ledger. During the years he lived under Orphaned Ashby's roof, Luther was often sent to bring broken barrels and leaky troughs to the workshop of Amos Reddick, an old cooper and well builder who repaired water troughs, lined stone wells, and built storage cisterns for stage stations across the territory. Amos noticed something unusual. The boy did not stare at tools. He watched how they worked. Instead of offering sympathy, Amos handed him work. Sorting iron hoops, soaking barrel staves, scraping away old pitch, choosing flat stones, tapping empty barrels until they revealed weak spots by sound alone. Little by little, lessons replaced words. Dark soil usually held moisture longer. White alkali on the surface did not mean every layer beneath was dead. Thin moss on the north face of a rock often pointed toward a hidden seep. Clear water was not always safe water. A misplaced stone pushed its weight onto every stone beside it. A settling basin always belonged upstream from a storage well, and every waterway needed a place to release mud before it reached the final reservoir. Amos repeated the same sentence so often that Luther never forgot it. Never measure with hope. Measure with evidence. On Luther's 17th birthday, Amos placed an Osage orange marking knife into his hand. Half-inch marks had been carved along the spine. He never called it a gift. He only said the blade had finally been sharpened for the right hand. A year later, Amos Reddick died quietly at the end of an ordinary workday. There was no accident, no final speech. He was found sitting against his workbench, one hand still holding a strip of hoop iron that had never been bent into shape. After the funeral, Orson sold nearly every tool in the shop to recover an old debt. Luther could not afford to buy a single one. The only thing he still owned was the marking knife Amos had placed in his hand. Amos had also kept a young bronze-colored dog around the workshop to guard wagons and chase rats. No one wanted him. Orson called the animal another useless mouth to feed. Luther never argued. That evening, he simply laid half of his cornbread beside the warehouse door. Copper stayed. From that night forward, Luther worked for Orson by day, repaired broken things in secret after dark, slept with Copper curled beside his feet, and carried the marking knife in his coat wherever he went. No one ever said the boy, the dog, and the knife had become a family. Nothing needed to be said. At the end of September 1881, Orson Ashby called Luther into the ledger room behind the warehouse. The meeting lasted only a few minutes. "The store has been sold," Orson said. "Silbert Dane takes possession next week. He'll bring his own men." Luther said nothing. "You're old enough to look after yourself now." Orson opened the ledger. "Your parents left very little. Food, clothing, lodging, medical expenses, repairs. It has all been accounted for." He slid a thin envelope across the table. "After every balance has been settled, $11 remain." He never called Luther worthless. His words were colder than that. "My obligation is complete. The accounts are balanced. There is nothing left to carry." Luther lowered his eyes to the open ledger. His name appeared between sacks of corn, horse feed, roof repairs, broken harness leather, and deducted expenses, like another item in storage. He never asked how much his parents had truly left behind. He picked up the envelope. In the small room behind the warehouse, he packed everything he owned: a worn wool blanket, a dented tin pot, a firebox, the Osage orange marking knife, a coil of hemp rope, a patched coat, 2 cloth sacks filled with coarse cornmeal. That was enough. Outside, Copper waited beside the back steps. Orson glanced at the dog. "That animal isn't my responsibility." Luther rested one hand on Copper's neck. "It never was." Those were the only words he spoke to his uncle before walking away. The warehouse door closed behind him with a dull wooden thud. Copper never looked back. Neither did Luther. Luther and Copper headed southwest. The first day tested them immediately. A hot wind drove dust across the prairie until it skimmed the ground like smoke. The water in Luther's canteen disappeared faster than he expected. By afternoon, Copper's pace had slowed. When they stopped, Luther removed the dented tin lid from his pot and poured a small measure of water into it. Copper drank first. Only after the dog finished did Luther raise the canteen and swallow what remained. By the second afternoon, they met Otis Rourke, a freight hauler carrying hides and rendered tallow toward Red Basin Crossing. One of the rear wagon pins had worked loose. Otis climbed down with a sigh. Luther examined the wheel without a word. Using his marking knife, a discarded piece of ash wood, and a length of hemp cord, he carved a temporary pin that fit tightly enough to keep the axle steady. The repair took only a few minutes. It carried the load again. Otis offered no money. Instead, he pointed toward the wagon. "Ride if you're heading west." He added a sack of dry cornbread and filled Luther's empty water jug before climbing back onto the driver's seat. Luther accepted. It was payment, not charity. As the wagon rolled across the dry country, Otis spoke about abandoned claims beyond the settlement. Drought had emptied many of them. Wells failed after only a few seasons. Families bought cheap land, struggled through one winter, then vanished before the next. "There is one place folks won't touch," Otis finally said. "Deadwell Ranch." Even the name sounded tired. "They say the well died years ago." That night, coyotes called from the distant hills. Copper lifted his head. He listened. Then he settled beside the wagon instead of wandering into the darkness. Red Basin Crossing was little more than a frontier stop, a general store, a land office, a livery stable, a sawmill, a small wooden church, a handful of wind-beaten houses. Copper lay beneath the porch while Luther stepped into the land office. Behind a scarred desk sat Nolan Pritchard, a gray-haired land clerk who had processed more impaled claims than successful ones. "What can I do for you?" he asked. "I need land I can afford." Nolan gave a faint smile. "The good land already has owners." He glanced at Luther's worn coat. $11 won't even buy a mule. Luther remained where he stood. "Do you have anything that's been abandoned for taxes?" The question changed the clerk's expression. Without speaking, Nolan reached beneath the desk and lifted a dusty file tied with faded string. "Alder Ridge Claim, cabin, 14 by 17 feet, 143-foot well, 160 acres, mostly dry grassland. Owner, Ephraim Alder, Missing for nearly 7 years. Back taxes unpaid. No current resident. Well presumed dead. Nolan closed the file. Transfer fee. $4. 2 for the record. 1 for the survey copy. 1 for the county seal. He looked directly at Luther. $4 won't buy water. Luther reached into his pocket. It buys the right to find out where the water went. 4 silver dollars landed on the desk. Nolan stared at the coins longer than he looked at the young man standing before him. For a moment, it was difficult to decide which one deserved more pity. By late afternoon, Luther and Copper reached Alder Ridge Claim. The ranch rested inside a shallow basin beneath the western slope. The cabin leaned toward the northwest. Part of the sod roof had torn away. The front door faced the direction of the winter wind. The L-shaped livestock shed had collapsed along one side. Willow fencing lay buried beneath dry grass. About 40 paces from the cabin stood the stone well. This was the Deadwell Ranch Otis had spoken of. Luther did not judge it all at once. Amos had taught him to read a place one piece at a time. He started with the cabin. The stone foundation was still level. 3 corner posts remained solid. The weathered cottonwood walls had turned gray, but the heartwood was still sound. The southern roof beam could be reused. The chimney throat was cracked, yet the firebox had not fallen in. Then he studied the land. Near the dry creek, the soil grew darker. Sagebrush thickened across the lower ground. Thin patches of moss clung to the north faces of scattered limestone rocks. Farther upslope, a line of dead cottonwoods curved across Alder Ridge in a way no natural stand of trees should. The well came last. Its upper ring had been built with greater care than anything else on the ranch. Several stones had been dressed smooth on the inside. Old chisel marks showed the work of an experienced mason. White mineral crust circled the base, but it appeared only in broken patches instead of an even ring. Copper wandered slowly around the north side of the well. Then he stopped. His nose remained fixed over one stretch of dry ground that felt noticeably cooler beneath the afternoon shade. Luther knelt beside the stonework. Using the half-inch marks on the spine of his knife, he measured the spacing between the joints. One section did not match the others. Someone had dismantled and rebuilt part of the stone ring after the well had first been finished. He rested one hand against the rim. Most of the stone was warm from the day's sun, but a narrow seam along the northern side was cool enough to make him wonder whether the people of Red Basin Crossing had mistaken silence for death. Luther carried his belongings into the cabin. Then he walked back outside. The roof could wait. Water could not. The last of his supply would barely last another day for himself, Copper, and the work ahead. He searched the ruined shed before touching the well again. Inside, he found a cracked wooden bucket, a length of weathered rope, 2 straight juniper poles, and part of an old hand wheel that had rotted along one edge. It was enough. He wrapped the bucket with strips of soaked rawhide until the cracks closed. He spliced fresh hemp rope onto the old line and lashed the juniper poles into a rough tripod above the well. Before lowering anything farther, he followed the habit Amos had drilled into him years before. Never trust a silent well. He lit a narrow strip of wick and lowered it several feet into the shaft. The flame weakened. It flickered, but it did not die. The air below could still be breathed. Only then did Luther begin clearing the well. Each bucket brought up another piece of the past. Rotten leaves, broken branches, fragments of an old well cover, dry mud, rabbit bones, loose stones. The work continued hour after hour. The rope burned across his palms until the skin split open. Copper rested beneath the cabin's shadow, yet every time the bucket struck the bottom of the shaft, he stood and walked back to the well, listening. Late in the afternoon, the sound changed. The bucket no longer landed with a dull thud. It rang against something harder, leaving a hollow echo beneath the stone lining. Luther leaned farther over the rim and hooked what felt like a large rock buried beneath the debris. He pulled. The eastern side of the well shifted. One stone slipped. Another cracked loose. Stop. He released the strain immediately. A single stone tumbled into the darkness. Once, twice, 3 times. Then silence. Copper sprang to his feet. Luther looked at the stone ring without touching the rope again. The lesson was clear. The well did not need more strength. It needed support before another pound of debris came out. For the first time since arriving at Deadwell Ranch, progress would begin by slowing down. The next morning, Luther refused to pull another bucket until the well was safe. He braced the weakened wall with 2 straight juniper poles, a heavy crosspiece, dry wooden wedges, and a tightening loop of rope. Only after the loose section stopped shifting did he begin removing stones one by one. Each rock came out in order. Each one returned to the ground beside the well. He searched for the locking stone that carried the pressure of the ring before rebuilding the course as he worked. Copper circled the north side again. This time, the dog scratched lightly at the earth and looked back. Luther followed the gesture. One stone, about chest high, caught his attention. Its edge was a different shade from the others. The joints around it did not match the original pattern. Fine scrape marks suggested it had been removed more than once. He slid the spine of the marking knife into the narrow seam and twisted gently. The stone moved, slowly, silently. Behind it lay a small chamber. It was far drier than the inside of the well itself. Luther reached inside. First came a linen bundle sealed with beeswax. Then a leather pouch filled with mixed coins, a small piece of raw silver, an iron key, a child's wooden horse with only one wheel remaining. Finally, a thick packet of folded papers. He opened the money pouch first. $18. No more. He set it aside without counting again. Then he unfolded the papers. His hands stopped moving. Drawn in charcoal and oak gall ink was a cross-section of Alder Ridge. Lines traced a buried settling basin beneath a stone outcrop, a horizontal collection trench, a cedar control gate, a mud overflow channel, and one final line ending at the well. The well was not marked as the source, it was labeled as the receiving basin. Along the edge of the drawing, one sentence had been written in a careful hand. If the well is dry, do not dig deeper. Find where the water stopped. Luther read the line twice. The people of Red Basin Crossing had spent years believing the well itself had failed. They had been wrong. The well had never been the beginning. It had always been the end of a much larger system. Copper rested his head against Luther's knee. The $18 remained untouched beside him. The drawings were worth far more. For $4, Luther had not bought a dead ranch. He had bought the chance to finish a piece of engineering that no one else had understood. That evening, Luther spread the drawings across the cabin table. He placed small stones on each corner to keep the wind from lifting the brittle pages. Copper settled beneath the table, his ears turned toward the door. Inside the waxed bundle was one final sheet, a letter. It was addressed to whoever proved patient enough to open the hidden chamber. Ephraim Alder wrote that he and his wife, Martha, had arrived long before anyone called the place Deadwell Ranch. They had discovered a slow seep emerging from the rock beneath Alder Ridge. Ephraim carved a collection trench into the hillside. Martha tested every patch of ground that held moisture the longest and planted where the soil answered instead of guessing. Together they built the first settling basin, the buried stone channel, the cedar gate, the overflow drain, and finally, the receiving well. Their young son, Jonah, spent his days pulling a small wooden horse across the yard while they worked. Then came the winter that stole both Martha and Jonah with lung sickness. Ephraim kept the system alive alone for a time, but after a violent mudslide clogged the collection trench, one man could no longer clear the hillside by himself. His letter contained no plea for remembrance, only one request. If you can make the water run again, let this house hear footsteps once more. Luther folded the letter with care. He laid it beside the marking knife and Jonah's broken wooden horse. Before blowing out the lantern, his eyes wandered to the cabin doorway. Faint height marks had been carved into the frame years before. The lowest cuts had nearly worn away. The highest still remained. Beside the final mark was one small letter, J. The next morning, Luther left the cabin to search for 2 forgotten graves. Using Ephraim's directions, Luther found the graves beneath a cottonwood tree split long ago by lightning. The marker stones had tilted. Wind and weather had nearly erased the names. Martha Alder, Jonah Alder. He did not build new monuments. He pulled away the dry weeds, reset the circle of stones, and used the marking knife to deepen the letters that could still be read. For a moment, he rested Jonah's wooden horse on the small grave. Then he carried it back to the cabin before rain could ruin what remained of it. That afternoon, Luther opened his notebook. First, find the settling basin. Second, locate the collection trench. Third, clear the blockage without collapsing the hillside. Fourth, let the water settle before testing it. Fifth, finish repairing the cabin. Last, spend the $18 only on supplies he could not make himself. He listed every remaining length of rope, every day's food, every bucket of water, every reusable stone and timber, every clue from Ephraim's drawings. It became a different kind of ledger. Not one that measured what a person had cost. One that measured what it would take to keep people alive through winter. Before closing the notebook, Luther wrote 2 names across the top of the first page. Martha, Jonah. Then the numbers began. Luther returned to Red Basin Crossing with a short shopping list. Fresh hemp rope, hand-forged nails, a used mattock head, salt, cornmeal, oiled leather for the cabin window, and a damaged sack of lime that had hardened around the edges but still held usable powder at its center. News traveled faster than freight wagons. By the time Luther reached the lumber yard, people were already calling him the owner of $4 Grave. Bramwell Pike, the settlement's master carpenter, looked up from his workbench. "So you're the fellow trying to bring Deadwell back?" Luther nodded. Bramwell studied him for a moment. "What wood belongs underground, where it's always damp?" "Cedar." "Why not green cottonwood for permanent wedges? It shrinks." "How much room do you leave at the end of a plank before driving a nail?" "Enough to keep it from splitting." "Better yet, bore a pilot hole." "On an old roof facing the wind, nails or battens?" "Battens." "What keeps clay mortar from cracking?" "Ash and fiber." Bramwell said nothing for several seconds. Finally, he gathered a bundle of cedar offcuts and pushed it across the counter. "I'll sell these at the regular price." He paused. "Pick through the short pieces if you want." Luther counted out the money without asking for a discount. Bramwell watched him do it. "You're not completely blind," he said at last. Then he tapped the cedar bundle. "If you ruin those, don't blame the ranch." Luther lifted the wood onto his shoulder. "I won't. Nature would decide whether either of them was right." According to Ephraim's drawing, the settling basin lay nearly 200 paces north of the well, hidden beneath a low ridge of stone. Luther followed the map. Copper followed the ground. Before long, they found the first signs. A shallow depression crossed the hillside. Flat stones rested beneath a layer of grass. Sagebrush grew thicker than anywhere nearby. When Luther dug only a hand's depth into the soil, the earth felt cooler. Copper stopped beside a narrow crack between 2 rocks and scratched at it. The scent of damp earth lingered there. Luther removed the stones one at a time. Beneath them lay the collapsed roof of the settling basin. Inside, years had collected. Red clay, tree roots, rotting leaves, fine sand, the broken remains of a cedar control gate. He did not clear everything at once. First, he dug a temporary overflow trench so loosened mud would spill away from the receiving well instead of into it. Only then did he continue. Late on the second day, something changed. A thin ribbon of water slipped through the trench. It moved quietly across the stones. The seep was alive, but the water carried red earth. It smelled heavy with wet soil. Fine sediment rolled through it with every trickle. Luther knelt beside the flow. He did not drink. He did not let Copper drink either. Instead, he guided the water into a shallow testing pit and left it untouched through the night. By sunrise, the water near the surface had cleared. The bottom held nearly 2 inches of settled mud. The seep had survived. The system had not. Luther folded Ephraim's drawing and looked back toward the hillside. Finding water had been only half the work. Unless the settling basin and overflow channel were rebuilt, the well would slowly bury itself again. Copper lowered his head toward the fresh water one more time. Luther reached out, rested his hand gently across the dog's muzzle, and pulled the bowl away. Their clean water was almost gone. He still refused to gamble with the new supply. While Luther worked around the settling basin, a wagon stopped outside the ranch. Mara Bell, a widowed homesteader from a neighboring claim, climbed Sumanayam, Sumanator Bell. Tobin was 10, Tobin was 7. Mara had not come to congratulate him. One of her wooden watering troughs had cracked, and her goats were losing precious water every day. Bramwell Pike had mentioned that the young man at Deadwell knew how to repair barrels and troughs. She offered a trade: cornmeal, sour goat's milk, a roll of goat hair, and one aging doe that still gave enough milk to earn her keep. In return, Luther would repair the trough and rebuild part of her fence. He agreed. No bargaining, no favors. Only work exchanged for work. At Mara's homestead, Luther repaired the trough with willow boards, rawhide lashings, pine pitch, and a thin cedar brace. Elsie watched every movement. "Why don't you seal every crack?" she asked. "Because dry wood swells," Luther answered. "If I force it too tight now, it'll split when it drinks." She nodded without another question. While Luther packed his tools, Tobin noticed the small wooden horse tucked inside his coat. "Did it ever roll?" he asked quietly. "It did once." The boy smiled. He never asked to keep it. Back at Deadwell Ranch, Luther mixed goat hair into clay and wood ash before pressing the chinking into the cabin walls. The fibers held the mixture together exactly as Amos had taught him. That night, new sounds filled the ranch. The old doe shifted inside the repaired shed. Copper padded slowly around the cabin. Water dripped into the settling pit with steady rhythm. The cabin was still cold, but for the first time in many years, it no longer sounded empty. The ranch improved a little each day. It also reminded Luther that every repair carried another lesson. The first mistake appeared in the cabin walls. His first batch of chinking contained too much clay. After 2 nights of frost, thin cracks spread through the seams. He scraped the mixture away. The next batch held less clay, more wood ash, shredded yucca fiber, and goat hair from Mara's trade. He pressed it into the gaps in thinner layers. This time, the walls held. The second mistake came from the roof. A strong southwest wind lifted 3 newly laid cedar shakes before sunset. Nails alone were not enough on weathered rafters. Luther fastened cedar battens across the roof, tying them to the strongest framing beneath. The wind returned 2 days later. The shingles stayed where they belonged. The third mistake came with rain. A brief storm filled the settling basin faster than expected. Mud rushed toward the channel. Copper barked from the hillside as water spilled over the edge. Luther hurried uphill, reopened the overflow path, and placed large stones across the inlet to slow the current before it reached the basin. The water calmed. The mud settled where it should, not where it could do harm. Before the ground had fully dried, another visitor arrived. Deputy Holland Reese rode into the yard carrying a leather satchel beneath one arm. He had questions. "Do you hold a legal claim?" Luther handed him the county papers. "Have you lived here continuously?" "Since the day I arrived." "Found any silver worth reporting?" Luther shook his head. $18. That was all. "Planning to sell the property?" "No." Instead of arguing further, Luther placed his notebook on the table inside the cabin. Holland opened it. Each page carried the same careful order. The hour of every water measurement, the number of buckets collected, the depth of settled sediment, the amount of timber used, the repairs that had failed, the corrections that followed. Nothing had been erased. Nothing had been hidden. Holland turned slowly back to the first page. Above every column of figures stood 2 names: Martha, Jonah. He looked at them for a long moment before closing the notebook. "You've done enough to prove you're improving the claim," he said quietly. "Whether it succeeds or not, nature will decide." Luther nodded. That had always been the only judge that mattered. Early December changed everything. The warning did not begin with snow. It began with silence. The afternoon wind stopped without reason. The northern sky turned the color of lead. The breath of livestock lingered low against the frozen ground instead of drifting away. Copper refused to leave the cabin porch. The old doe stood with her back toward the same direction for nearly an hour. A thin sheet of ice formed across the water trough long before sunset. A message reached the ranch through Nolan Pritchard. The northern mail station had reported a fast-moving cold front pushing south. Later that day, Bramwell Pike rode past the property. He studied the roof from horseback. If the wind swings, he warned, that old roof will find every weak place. Luther answered by checking every system one final time. The roof battens, the door wedges, the fresh chinking, the chimney throat, the shed doors, the settling basin, the overflow channel, the well cover. He buried the shallowest section of the water channel beneath another layer of earth. He covered the settling basin with dry grass for insulation. He carried the smallest water trough into the shed before darkness fell. Then he measured everything. Outside temperature, water level in the well, firewood remaining, buckets of clean water stored inside the cabin. Copper followed him without leaving his side. Night arrived. Still no snow. Then the wind shifted. North. West. The first hard gust struck the outer door like a heavy log. Nature never announced its judgment. It simply changed every condition the ranch would have to survive. The blizzard arrived after midnight. Fast, cold, merciless. Wind screamed across the basin, driving snow and alkali dust into one endless gray wall. The roof shuddered. Cedar shakes strained against the rafters. The battens groaned. They held. The cabin walls answered next. The repaired chinking crackled under the sudden freeze. Tiny sounds, sharp sounds, but the seams stayed closed. Cold still crept across the floorboards. The walls stopped the wind where it mattered most. Then the chimney failed. The changing wind forced smoke back into the cabin. Luther moved immediately. He narrowed the air opening beneath the fire, fed the stove hotter, positioned a temporary stone baffle inside the firebox to steady the draft. Slowly, the smoke lifted. The chimney breathed again. Outside, every shallow trough froze solid. Inside the well, the water kept moving. The buried seep never met the freezing air. The insulated settling basin protected the flow. The stream slowed. It never stopped. Then Copper exploded into barking. Not at the storm. At the door. A weak pounding followed. Luther pulled it open against the wind. Mara stood outside, with Elsie and Tobin pressed against her. Snow covered their coats. Their barn roof had collapsed. The hand pump had frozen. Their wagon horse had gone lame trying to pull free. No speeches were needed. Luther stepped aside. They came in. The door closed. The goat remained safe inside the shed. The stored water was measured before it was poured. Each person received only what the notebook allowed. Nothing more, nothing less. The night became a pattern of necessary work. Drying gloves, wrapping blankets tighter, feeding the fire, clearing snow away from the door, checking the chimney, listening to the roof, waiting for the next gust. Hours passed. The cabin remained standing. Near the stove, Tobin finally fell asleep. His hand still rested around Jonah's little wooden horse. Luther noticed. He left it there. Until morning, it belonged exactly where it was. By the second morning, the wind had begun to weaken. The basin emerged slowly from the drifting snow. Across the surrounding claims, the storm had left its judgment. Fence lines disappeared beneath deep drifts. 2 livestock sheds had collapsed under the weight of snow. Several shallow wells had frozen solid. At one homestead, muddy runoff had poured directly into the water supply. Deadwell Ranch still stood. Before noon, Bramwell Pike rode in beside Deputy Holland Reese. Neither man came to congratulate Luther. They came to inspect. Bramwell climbed onto the roof first. He checked every cedar batten, every nailhead, every exposed rafter. He ran his hand across the chinking and studied the chimney throat without speaking. Nothing had shifted. Nothing important had failed. Meanwhile, Holland walked to the well. This time he did not ask for the claim papers. Instead, he carefully inspected every proof of survival on the land, the signs of weathering the storm, the steadily updated water ledger, the restored seep channel, and the settling basin. Then he asked Luther to draw water from the well. The first bucket carried a small amount of fine sediment, expected after a storm. The second bucket rose clear. Holland watched Luther lower the line again. The water level dipped only slightly before beginning to recover. Luther opened his notebook. Before the repairs, the well had been nearly dry. After reopening the seep, the standing water held at roughly 31 inches. The well supplied 7 to 9 full buckets before showing any meaningful drop. During the blizzard, the cabin had remained about 20 degrees warmer than the outside air. After the new chinking was finished, the woodpile had lasted noticeably longer through each freezing night. No claim rested on opinion. Every page held measurements. Every correction had been recorded beside the mistake that caused it. Bramwell closed the notebook and looked back toward the roof. The battens held. He stood in silence for another moment. Then he nodded once. "I was wrong about this ranch." No one answered. No one needed to. Inside the cabin, Mara, Elsie, and Tobin were alive. Outside, clear water filled the trough. The roof still covered the walls. Those were the only arguments that mattered. Holland removed a pencil from his coat and added one final note to the county record. The claimant had established continuous residence. The land had been actively improved. The claim remained valid. Later that afternoon, Nolan Pritchard arrived from town. He stopped beside the trough and watched fresh water spill into it. For a long time he said nothing. He never repeated the words he had spoken in the land office. $4 had not bought water. It had bought the chance to understand where the water had been waiting all along. 1 year later, Alder Ridge Claim had not become a wealthy ranch. It had become a working one. The cabin held warmth better through every cold night. A small livestock shed stood where broken boards had once leaned. A handful of goats grazed the hillside. A drought-tolerant garden grew beside the restored water line. The rebuilt fences kept the animals where they belonged. The settling basin rested safely beneath its blanket of earth. The well produced a steady flow of clean water. Neighbors began visiting to study the underground seep system. Luther never called it his own invention. Whenever someone asked, he unfolded Ephraim's drawing and pointed to the title written across the page, Alder Seep Line. Bramwell Pike adapted the settling basin design for another ranch farther west. Mara rebuilt her livestock trough with a proper overflow channel. Deputy Holland Reese kept a copy of the drawings inside the county records. Elsie learned how to mark daily water levels in a ledger. Tobin sometimes rolled Jonah's little wooden horse across the cabin porch. He always placed it back on the railing before leaving. Luther Ashby never came to apologize. A freight driver passing through mentioned hearing stories about the boy who had turned a $4 ranch into a working homestead. Luther asked no questions. He sent no letters. Vindication did not need an argument. Late one afternoon, he stood beside the cedar water trough. Amos's marking knife rested comfortably in his hand. Jonah's wooden horse waited on the porch railing. Copper slept at his feet. Fresh water flowed steadily through the cedar channel. Amos had given him the knowledge to build. Ephraim had given him the place where that knowledge could continue. Nature had decided whether the work deserved to survive. It offered no praise. It offered no explanation. The water simply kept flowing. Copper lifted his head as Tobin ran laughing across the yard. The little wooden horse rolled once along the railing before stopping beside the marking knife. Below them, clear water continued filling the trough. Some ledgers measured what people consumed. This one measured what they protected. And on the quiet frontier, that was enough.